Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service, with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
People started disappearing.
De Guzman just fell out of a helicopter.
Uh-oh, what's going on here?
The $6 billion gold scam from the BBC World Service and CBC.
Money is very, very dangerous.
Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. Hello, I'm Oliver Conway. We're recording this at 13 hours GMT on Wednesday the 5th of June. Climate scientists warn that the rate of global warming is at an all-time high. 4 women register as candidates for Iran's presidential election, but do they stand a chance? And mass graves and body bags, what happened during the Israeli raid on Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza? Also in the podcast, the high price being paid by the victims of sextortion.
These people are just going through the script and putting that pressure on, and they're doing it quick because then they can move on to the next person because it's about volume.
And the contribution of women to the D-Day landings 80 years ago. Given the scorching temperatures seen over the past year, it may not come as a surprise, but a new report says human activity is heating up the world at a record rate. The climate scientists behind the study are warning that the threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels could be breached within 5 years. In a speech to mark World Environment Day, the UN Secretary-General will warn that the world is not doing enough to switch away from coal, oil and gas. One of the authors of the new report is Carina von Schuckmann.
What we are aiming for is to provide annual tracks between the different IPCC reports, which are published every 7 years. It is clear that there is a rapid need of taking action to reduce carbon emissions. If we do not act today, the window on missing 1.5 degrees is closing.
Our environment correspondent Matt McGrath told me more about the findings.
Yes, this is a report called The Indicators of Global Change. It's being published, as you heard in the clip there, to kind of fill in the gaps when the UN's official body isn't meeting. They report about every 6 to 7 years on the state of the climate. Now, this report, as you said, highlights the fact that global warming is increasing. It's increasing at about just over a quarter of a degree Celsius per decade. That's up from the 1970s and 1980s when it was about 0.18 Celsius per decade. So they say it's at a high level, warming increasing at a rate not seen before. And they point out that last year was about 1.43 degrees warmer than the long-term average, the 1850 records. But most of that came from human activities. About 92% was that down to human activities and about 8% due to natural events such as El Niño, which we've talked about before.
This warning about the 1.5 degree threshold, is there anything that can be done?
Yes, I mean, it comes in a long line of warnings of telling people that, that this threshold, which was agreed in the Paris Agreement in 2015 and is critically important to developing states and small island states, that threshold should be gone, could be gone, surpassed in 5 years or so. That's obviously the nature of the warning is very stark from, and we'll hear probably later today from the UN Secretary-General more about that. And countries are girding up to try and put plans in place to cut emissions to that level. But at the moment, those emissions are still going up. They may be slowing down in their rise, but they're still going up, and that puts that target very much in danger. And most scientists would admit privately it's a goner.
We keep hearing scepticism from some politicians that people are willing to take action. So if it's a goner, are we going to have to think about perhaps a new strategy?
Yes, indeed. I'm sure that is informing the minds of scientists and politicians. I think the big question with these type of reports, the big issue really here that scientists really worry about is whether or not the rate of warming is accelerating and whether we're going to hit some tripping points that will really make things much worse. Now, while the rate of increase seen in these reports and today's report is the highest on record, the scientists take some comfort from the fact that it's not beyond the bounds of what they predicted. Essentially, it's where they said we would be at several decades ago. It's not going any faster than that, and that is some small comfort in this particular report.
Our environment correspondent, Matt McGrath. The Gaza ceasefire plan set out by President Biden last week has still not been agreed by Hamas or by Israel, where the far-right Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir today stepped up his opposition to it. The proposal is due to be discussed by security officials from the US, Egypt and Qatar. But as the talking goes on, Israel has announced a new military campaign in central Gaza. Nearly 8 months after the 7th of October massacre, it has been unable to defeat Hamas and has returned to the scene of previous battles. In March, Israel carried out a second raid on Al-Shifa Hospital, where it said it killed more than 200 terrorists without a single civilian casualty. However, the BBC has found evidence that civilians were killed. From Istanbul, our Gaza correspondent Rushdie Abu-Alouf has this report, which some listeners may find distressing.
On the 1st of April, Palestinians poured over the ruins of what was once Gaza's biggest hospital. Israeli forces had just ended their second military raid at Al-Shifa. Since then, local search teams say they have found 4 mass graves and have dug up hundreds of bodies at the site. It's led to international calls for an investigation into possible war crimes. Rami Dababish from the Palestinian Civil Defense told us of suspicious finds.
We've discovered bodies of women and children and people without heads, as well as torn body parts.
The Israeli military says it did exhume bodies which Palestinians had buried earlier, as it searched for hostages seized by Hamas. But some of those found in the graves were patients. Walid Fatima believes his elderly mother Lena died of malnutrition and dehydration. Her corpse was badly decomposed.
I identified her from particular marks on her legs. She'd been wounded in November and had a toe amputated on each foot.
Israel blames any deaths of patients on natural causes. But the local representative of the World Health Organization, Dr. Rick Peppercorn, who went to visit Al-Shifa, says those trapped endured horrific conditions.
During the siege, 20 patients died. There were patients who couldn't get oxygen. There was not proper medication, but also the food and water. There are stories that 15 people had to share 1 bottle of water.
Israel's army says Palestinian gunmen were based inside Al-Shifa and killed more than 200 Hamas and Islamic Jihad operatives in a space of 2 weeks. The Israeli government spokesman Avi Hyman gave a briefing at the end of the raid.
Shifa has become a main terrorism command center for Hamas. The surprise action by our forces was precise and surgical.
But the fighting with Palestinian armed groups reached the streets around the hospital. There was widespread destruction. I spoke to witnesses who told me that many civilians had been killed. One man told me he was a sole survivor of an Israeli airstrike that killed 23 members of his family.
This was somebody who wanted to develop as a well-rounded surgeon who was utterly committed to his people and to work in Gaza.
Dr. Ahmad Al-Makadma was a dedicated surgeon. He was shot dead close to the hospital where he worked. The BBC spoke to a top British plastic surgeon, Tim Goodacre, who helped train him.
He was hungry for knowledge. He was a very gentle and somebody who all of us would want to have as our sort of doctors.
Dr. Ahmad was off shift and at home near Al-Shifa Hospital when Israeli forces moved in. He was stuck there for 4 days and interrogated by Israeli soldiers. Dr. Ahmad then tried to leave Gaza City on foot with his mother Yusra. His father Saeed told us they found his decomposed body 11 days after he disappeared. The Israel's military says it's unaware of the death of the surgeon and his mother. Many in Gaza are still searching for their loved ones who have been missing since the raid on Al-Shifa Hospital in April. International forensic experts cannot access the site, and many worried that full truth of what happened here may never be uncovered.
Our Gaza correspondent Rushdie Abu-Alouf. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi told his supporters yesterday he was, quote, very, very happy with the outcome of the general election. But he can't have been too pleased to lose his majority, getting 160 fewer seats than he'd been aiming for. Instead of presiding over a supermajority, which would allow him to change the constitution, he's now having to build a coalition in order to govern. But what does that mean for the Indian economy? Here's our India business correspondent, Arunadhay Mukherjee.
Earlier, the BJP, with absolute majority, had no compulsion to take other parties along whenever it needed to enact laws or outline spending. But now, for the first time since 2014, India is back to an era of coalition politics, which means consensus will be key. India might be one of the fastest growing economies in the world, but there are challenges ahead for the next 5 years. Unemployment among India's educated youth has increased. Inequality has widened to a 100-year high, and manufacturing as a share of GDP has remained stagnant for a decade. As India aims to become the third largest economy in the world in the next 3 years, the next 5 years for the government in power will be key. And with coalition politics back, the question is, will economics drive politics, or will politics drive economics?
Arunadhay Mukherjee in Delhi. And as we record this podcast, we've just heard a statement from India that the Modi-led alliance has now agreed to form the next Indian government. Last week, a snap election was announced in Iran following the death of President Raisi in a helicopter crash. Candidate registration closed on Monday with 80 people signing up, including 4 women. But in the 45-year history of the Islamic Republic, no woman has ever been allowed to stand for Iranian president. So will they this time? I asked Faranak Amidi, the World Service Women's Affairs reporter.
I really find that unlikely to happen. With the situation we are seeing right now in Iran, with clampdown on women and normalization of violence against women on the streets and pavements across the country by morality police, it is very unlikely to see that you're going to have a female president or to be able to even run for presidency and pass the vetting, because the system, as a lot of Iranian women's rights activists and political activists call the regime, a gender apartheid. The whole system is designed to keep women, at the best of the situations, second-class citizens. So it is very unlikely for that to happen and for them to actually pass the vetting. No woman has ever passed the vetting of the Council of Experts.
Given that, why would they put their names forward?
Well, a lot of people might look at it and think that these women are there to push boundaries and challenge the status quo. I mean, there was one woman who was doing that back in the 90s, and she registered twice. That was the late Azam Talaqani. But these women, from what they're saying, the speeches they've done after the registration, they basically say that we've been so loyal to the Constitution, to the Supreme Leader, and they are kind of demanding a reward for their loyalty rather than